Hey, it's the Grumpy Gunsmith back again. Today we're going to do trigger plate, how to pin a trigger and put the tang bolt down through into the trigger plate on this rifle that I'm building right now. So not terribly difficult. I'll show you a few steps how to do it and then try it at home. Alright, let's get started. Alright, in this episode I'm going to quickly show you how to locate the trigger plate and all that stuff. Got this gun I've been working on here. Pretty well shaped out on the back end, but I've got to get the trigger and trigger guard in. If you've got one of my trade gun kits, or like most trade guns, of course you don't have to worry about a trigger plate. But you do have to worry about placement of the trigger. And what you want to do is, if you know exactly where the sear is, which is basically in the center of the inlet on this one, you want to have it pretty close to the rear of your trigger. That way as it pivots, it'll require least amount of movement possible to get it to trip that sear. And what I do is I line it up where I want it. I'm not worried about height yet, that'll all be trimmed down. But I'm looking at the front of the trigger here where the web is and line it up with the bottom of the stock and line up the bottom of the trigger rear with that too, leaving a little bit of space for the trigger plate. And then I'll simply mark it front and back, and that'll be where I want to inlet that in the center of the stock on the bottom. Now this one has already got the cutout for the trigger, as you can see here, but you can also see my pencil marks where I've put those in to tell me where to put the trigger and trigger plate. And get you in here a little closer so you can see the rear of this, the front of this, and I've already cut this with a Dremel enough for this to drop right in. Now the trade gun kits come with this already cut out pretty close, so it's you know, you don't have to worry about doing this part. But all I did was take an 1/8 inch Dremel and just slowly start taking this down until this fell in all the way. You do want to, as you can see, leave a little bit more at the back and relieve that, because as the trigger goes down, it kind of also goes back a little bit. So by relieving the back end a little bit extra, it'll give that space that it needs to pivot properly. The next step, once you got this in there, if you're going to use a trigger plate, which I do on all my rifles of course, I position that over the hole. I'm looking down through here, making sure it's lined up with the front, that it's centered on the gun stock itself, and then I'll simply draw around this. And then I'll start inletting it. Now this one does have a little bit thicker area, so I'll mark that. This will be the thick part, this is the thinner part. Everything's centered up nicely. And once I get the trigger and trigger plate in, then I can put the tang screw in through this heavy bolster area at the front. Yeah, it might be a little tricky to see here. Let's go back a little bit. Alright. Now I'm going to go ahead and inlet this just like you normally would with anything you're going to inlet. Inlet it undersized and then take the width out as you need to along the way. Now some people might put a small screw at the back of the trigger plate to hold it in, but generally, let me find my trigger guard here. Oh, there it is. If you design this properly and the trigger's in the right place, the back of the bow here on the trigger guard should be pressing down on that to hold it in place. So you really don't need anything to hold the rear of the trigger plate down. At least that's the way I've always done it, and it's worked fine for me. After building hundreds of guns, that's the way it's done. And I've never seen too many flintlocks that have a screw in the back down here. That's usually something they might add later, usually as a repair or something if they replace the trigger or trigger plate. But I'm going to go ahead and inlet this trigger plate in, and then I'll show you what else we need to do after that, getting the trigger guard in and the tang screw. So hang on and I'll be right back. Okay, got the trigger plate in here, and we'll just mark it. Remember, there's a bolster here about a ½ inch long, and that'll be for the tang screw. Now you got to turn it sideways, and what I want to do now is put a pin in there, or your punch, whatever, so you know where that punch mark is, and we'll look up above it, and when we mark the tang, I want to make sure that the tang screw head is going to be flat. Don't want it angled out or either way. I want it nice and parallel with the tang itself. So I'm just going to mark this about where I think it should be. Just drawing a pencil line from side to side. You can see that now. And then I put a punch mark in the center of that. And that's where the tang screw will be. So now I'll just drill through the metal itself. I won't go through the wood. I'm just going to drill a pilot hole on both sides. And then we use the drill press to finish drilling this all the way through. And I'll show you how we get that so that everything is centered up properly and that the screw goes through without any wobbles. I've done this in a previous video about how to set this up and drill these holes properly with no fuss, no muss. As long as you got a drill press, it works great. If you don't, what you do then is drill partway through drill through the metal on both sides, and then you can line up a pin punch or something in the hole you made. Put your drill here and start drilling in, and it's something that I kind of get at a 45-degree angle, and I can eyeball from one side to the other and drill it about halfway through, and then go halfway through from the other side using the pin on the other side. But the way I'll show you in the drill press goes much easier. You do it in one shot. You don't have to worry about being off center at all on either side. So let me get the camera and the drill press set up, and we'll do that next. Okay, here we are back at the bench. What I'm going to do now is countersink this. I've got my drill here, making sure that I'm level and parallel this way. Get my tang screw here so I can make sure I don't over countersink. pretty close. Now we gotta put the trigger plate back in. And run our tap down from the top of the tang down into run the tang through the tang hole. We'll run this down. Now this one is just a little short. I'm already bottoming out. So you can do two things. If it's really close, you can simply just run your tap out a little bit put that back in again and get the tap started till you got a good thread or two in there, and then you can take the trigger plate out and from the inside here just finish threading this. So you should be able to get it to catch where it did, and you can just finish threading it by hand. And there we go. Put the trigger plate back in place and we can stick the tang screw in. Now if your tap is too short to even do this, there's another type of tap you can get. This is a 6-inch long one. They're called pulley taps. Like for threading a pulley, you know, built-in pulley. And this will go in, and you got more than enough length to thread any depth hole you need up to 6 inches. I like having these around for some of the trade guns I do because they are a little bit thicker from top to bottom, and these cut real good. So I think McMaster Carr sells these. You can sometimes find them on eBay, but look for pulley taps. Now let's get this trigger plate back in. And the screw should go in nice and easy. I like using these screwdrivers that have interchangeable bits so I can get the right thickness. If some of these slots are a little small, I'll probably widen this slot out a little bit with a small needle file later. But this is fine for now. And as you can see, it's a little bit proud there. So I'll just take a saw, hacksaw, or actually I like to use a jeweler's saw with a coarse blade on it, and I'll cut that off flush with the plate and then finish it off by filing to get a nice smooth edges. Then we go on to getting the trigger in, and I'll show you what we do to get that and make sure it's pinned in the proper place. So that's coming up next, so hang on. Okay, we got the trigger plate in, tang bolts in, I've got it trimmed down nice and flush, and it's time to get the trigger in and pin it. And you can see I got it so it's working pretty good in there. To measure where you want to put the hinge pin for this trigger, you turn it sideways, and by lining this up, I don't want this sticking down below the trigger plate. I want it sticking up a little bit. And take a pencil here and mark where the front of the trigger is. And then when I lay this on top, I line it up with my pencil line the top of the trigger web with the top of the trigger plate, and line the rear of the trigger web up to the trigger plate where it's going to be. And now I can see basically where this is the web, and that's where it's going to be, and I'll just kind of mark it quickly. And the idea is you want to pin this up in the front as high as you can get, so that you got the least amount of movement of the trigger when you set the gun off. And right now it's looking like the best place to put the pin would be right here in the top of the thick part, which is good. I like that. If you get a trigger pin that's down in the bottom here, it's got less support on this side, and I prefer it to be up on the top end. That way you got a longer pin, more support on both sides of that pin, which will last longer over time. So that is where I'm going to put the hole. So now we just grab a drill and a 1/16 inch bit, and we drill down through my marked spot, trying to keep as straight as possible. Until I feel it go into the trigger cavity there. And I will stop, put the trigger back in, set it where I want it to be. And drill just enough to mark it. And I know it's probably hard for you to see, but I've got a mark right there, a little circle, and that'll be just about right. It's a little bit close to the front edge, but it'd still be plenty of meat. So that's where I will finish drilling this hole. So let me do that real quick, and then I'll come right back. Alright, got that hole drilled all the way through now. So we'll set this in place. And one thing you got to be careful about, let me flip this over, take your trigger or your side plate off. That is going to get in the way, and you don't want to drill a hole through it. You want the pinhole to be underneath there and hidden. Now if your drill bit is not long enough to go all the way through, go down to the hardware store and get you one of these. It's a 6-inch 1/16 inch bit, and that will make sure that you go all the way through. And we'll see if this bit will do it by itself. Some of my DeWalt drill will not hold a 1/16 inch bit very well. This is going to be too thick, because I don't want to go down too close with the drill bit jaw or it'll actually make marks on the wood and possibly put a divot in there, and I don't want that. So I'd rather switch over to the long bit. If I can get it out of the package here. Yeah. Use a long bit and drill all the way through. Like that. Now, theoretically, the trigger should fit in there fine, and the way I check it, I got my 16th inch pin punch, which I will use as a temporary hinge pin. And that looks pretty good. I will need to clear it for a little bit more movement, which means digging out the cavity for the trigger a little bit, but that'll work fine. Now we just got to test it with the lock, so I need to put the lock back together and set it in here so I can adjust the trigger. So more than likely I need to take some of the top of this web off to make it work properly, and you don't want to take too much, so I want to start with it too high and work my way down. And to do that, I'm going to use this pin punch again, but I'm going to come from the back side up so that I can pull it out and put it in as I need to keep removing this and adjusting it. So let me get the lock back together, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how we adjust all this. Okay, I'm back. Got the lock assembled, well, mostly assembled. You don't need the mainspring, you don't need to put the frizzen and all that on to adjust this. What you want to do is set it in place. I've got the trigger temporarily pinned with the punch on the bottom side here, which you can't see. And I can tell already that I need to remove some off the top of that trigger because there's absolutely no play in it. And if I try to cock it, it'll cock fine, but it won't stay at full cock because of that. So what I'll do now is simply pull the pin out, and I'll file a little bit off the top of this, just a little bit. I'd rather take it in steps than to try and take it all at once and end up taking off too much and having to repair it. So let me file a little bit on this, and then I'll be right back. Alright, I filed a little bit off. I'm going to set this back in place, and I can tell I still need to do a little bit more because I've got the front of the triggers hitting the plate like it should, but if you look closely you'll see a bit of the web on the bottom here sticking out, and I want that to be flush, so I need to go up at least another 1/16 of an inch, and we'll see how that works out. So a little more filing. Alright, I got that filed down to I think where it needs to be. I'm making sure the lock is in tight. Of course, you'll have to do final adjustments when you put lock bolts in because that'll draw it in, and it might even cant it a little bit one way or the other. But as you can see at rest now, I've got just a little bit of play in the trigger. Half cock, about the same. Full cock, a little bit. But when I release the full cock, you know, it lets off nice and easy. So there's no binding. And a little bit of play like that in there is good. I mean, you could get a little bit tighter, but wood shrinks and swells, and sometimes they might get a little too tight. I'd rather have a little bit of play in there because you're going to take up that play when you get ready to pull the trigger. Now the other thing I noticed about this trigger is that the trigger guard I'm using means that this trigger is about 1/8 of an inch too long. So what I need to do now is I'll file and clean this up and heat up this curl on the end and simply hammer it around a little bit more when I've got a propane torch on it and just curl it a little bit further, and that will shorten it down, make it fit the trigger bow better. But that's basically all you do when you're getting this set in. Just make sure that you mark it and you pin it as high up as you can, and take that web down on the back of the trigger just a little bit at a time until you get just a tiny bit of play in there, and that's all you need. Alright, so till next time, I will see you later. Take care.